Like a garden snail leaves a trail behind, a story snail leaves a tail behind. Share our stories and you may find you can tell a story too.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Snail Tales Assembly. I look a little bit different for this one, don't I? That's because the first Thursday in every March is World Book Day, and lots of people love to dress up as their favourite characters from some of their favourite books. One of my favourite writers is Roald Dahl, and maybe that can help you work out exactly what kind of animal I'm supposed to look like. Yep, that's right, I am Fantastic Mr. Fox. A story that Roald Dahl said was inspired by the forest that he used to live very close to. A forest called Angling Spring Wood. Roald used to walk through that forest pretty much every day whenever he was heading between his home and the town. And he used to stop and look at some of the trees all around and have a think about what sort of stories they could contain within them. And there was one tree in particular that Roald liked to imagine stood above the home of a fox who was regularly embroiled in bitter clashes with 3 local farmers. You know, you can actually still go to Angling Spring Wood today and look at all the beautiful scenery that Roald Dahl used to enjoy. Well, nearly all of it. Unfortunately, that special tree that Roald believed was above the home of Mr. Fox, that's been chopped down now. But there are many other trees that would have still been there when Roald Dahl was wandering around. Of course, one of the reasons why Roald Dahl was good at writing stories was because he was also very good at listening to stories. You may know, if you've read Boy, that Roald Dahl's mum used to tell him lots of wonderful stories, and he never stopped listening to them. In fact, there is one story in particular from there in Angling Spring Wood that may well have reminded Roald Dahl of one of the stories that he heard from his mum. And this is the story of a woman who was really crotchety, really grumpy. She was so grumpy she didn't really like talking to anybody else because they would just make her mad. So she stayed in her home pretty much all the time. In fact, she was so grumpy that even when she got holes in her roof, she didn't bother getting anybody in to fix them because that would mean that she'd have to talk to them. But if she didn't fix those holes, then, well, the rain would get in, wouldn't it? So to make sure she didn't get wet, she would always wear a yellow coat and a purple hat, even indoors, just so that she didn't have to talk to anybody to get those holes in the roof fixed. That is how grumpy this woman was. Even so, this woman really loved baking cakes. Oh yes, she loved baking really large cakes that she would get to eat all to herself. No, she wouldn't share them with you. She wouldn't share them with anybody. Because remember, if you share with someone, that means you need to talk to them. She was so grumpy, she would bake these brilliant cakes and then eat them all by herself. Until the start of this story. You see, at the beginning of this story, it was raining really hard. So there was lots of water coming into the woman's kitchen as she was trying to bake a lovely cake. And then she heard a knock at the door. Oh, now remember, when we storytellers say something like, "There was a knock at the door," we need you to make the sound of the knock by knocking on something hard, like this. So let's try that all together when I go back to that bit in the story. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Now, of course, this woman didn't really like talking to people, did she? So she just tried to ignore it. But as she kept on baking cakes in her kitchen, there was another knock at the door. And again, she tried to ignore it, keeping on baking her cakes, but still there was a knock at the door. And by now, the woman was ready to say the only words that she was happy to say to somebody else. I bet you can guess what those were. She went over, ready to open the door and shout, "Go away!" But before she could get the words out, as she looked outside, she was so surprised by what she saw, all her mouth did was this. That's because standing outside her door was a very tall man who had clothes that looked like they were very old and they were falling apart, and he was absolutely soaked right to the bone. But his eyes seemed to be glowing, almost with a strange blue light. Well, it was enough to stop the woman so that he got to speak to her first. And he said, "Dear lady, please will you let me into your house so that I can get some shelter from this rain?" Now, does this woman sound like the kind of woman who would let a complete stranger come into her house for shelter from the rain? Well, then the woman started to think a bit more. She thought about what might happen if she didn't let him in. First, he would get really cold and wet. Then he would probably die. Then everybody else would find him and they would all come round to knock on her door. And they would want to talk to her and ask her questions about why she didn't let him in, and then maybe she'd even get taken to prison, and then she'd have to talk some more, and, well, it was starting to turn into a nightmare. So, in order to make sure that she didn't have to talk to any more people, the woman thought maybe she should just let this one person in. So she brought him in. But she didn't let him sit on the sofa, no, because, well, he'd get it all wet, wouldn't he? Instead, she asked him to sit on a stool in the corner, while she went back into the kitchen to continue on with her work. But as the woman opened the door to her kitchen, the smell of the cakes came through, and of course, it made those wonderfully bright blue eyes of this poor man seem to shine even brighter. And he called out, "Oh, that smells like such an amazing feast you are preparing in there. Oh, I know I am not worthy of having any morsel of food from your kitchen, dear lady, but if you could spare even so much as a crumb, I would be ever so grateful." Now, does this woman sound like the kind of woman who's going to share her cake with a complete stranger like that? Well, then the lady started to think, and she thought that if she didn't give him any food, well, then he might start to go hungry, and if he went hungry, well, then he could die, and then there would be lots of people coming round to her house to knock on her door and ask her lots of questions, and maybe even take her to the police station where more people would want to talk to her, and the woman started to think that on this one occasion, she would share some of her cake with this stranger, just to make sure she didn't have anybody else coming around and asking questions. So the woman went into the kitchen and closed the door behind her. For one good reason. She didn't want the stranger to see the nice big cake that she had been cooking, because then he might want to have a nice big chunk of it. No, she wanted him to think that she only had a little bitty cake, because then he wouldn't mind so much about having such a very small crumb. So what she did instead was she took a knife and she cut a slice of that cake. And then she started to pat it down so that it looked like that one slice was a whole cake, because then she could just give him a slice of the smaller cake, and it would look to him like he was getting a pretty good meal. You can actually help her maybe if you start to pat the cake shape with your hands. I'm making a fairly round cake here, but, well, you could make a square one, or maybe even a triangle one, or a star one. The thing is, as she started patting this cake down, something incredible happened. And it began to get bigger. As she was patting, the cake took up more and more space in front of her. And the woman was amazed. Her hands had turned into magic baking hands. This was the best day of her life. But then she thought about the stranger in the room next door. He didn't deserve to have a cake this big. especially if it was a magic cake. So what she did was she took her knife and she cut out a slice of her new magic cake. She pulled that out and she started to pat that slice down so that it would look like just one cake. And when she gave a slice of it to the stranger, he would think he was getting quite a decent amount. So she started to pat that slice, and you can do this as well. You can start to pat this slice into another small cake. But as she did that, the cake began to get bigger and bigger and bigger, until once again she had another huge cake. And at once the lady was really excited that her hands were magic, but also a little bit annoyed because she didn't want the stranger to have a huge cake. So once again she took her knife, she cut out a slice, and she began to pat that slice down. And as she began to pat, well, you guessed it, the cake got bigger and bigger and bigger. Do you know what? I'm feeling a little bit bad now because, well, sometimes we storytellers, we like to trick people, and I've just been tricking you. You see, I told you, didn't I, that this lady had been taking out a slice of cake and patting it down into the shape of a whole cake, and then it was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But the truth is that the lady didn't really have magic hands at all. In fact, what was really going on was all to do with that stranger. You see, the reason that stranger had such wonderful blue eyes was because he was, in fact, an angel. He had been given the power to cast some magic over this lady. And so as she had been patting the cakes, it wasn't the cakes that were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In fact, the lady was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. As the lady got smaller, to her the cakes looked like they were huge. And every time she would cut off a new slice and start to pat it down, the cake would seem to grow and grow. But really, that woman was getting smaller and smaller and smaller until she was the same size as a slug. Because she had been wearing her yellow coat, that slug was a bright yellow colour. And because she'd been wearing her purple hat, the head of this slug looked purple. And that slug can now be found in Angling Spring Wood. If you do happen to walk through that forest, tread around the leaves very carefully, because you never know where one of those yellow slugs may lie. And if you do find it, definitely take a photo of it, because it is quite rare, even in Angling Spring Wood. You can see photos of it on the internet, but if you can get one yourself, then I'm sure you'll get into the newspapers. Please also send it to us so we can mention you on one of our next Snail Tales Assemblies. And I wonder if hearing that story inspired some of Roald Dahl's own characters and creations. He does seem to have quite a lot of grumpy old women in his books, doesn't he? As well as quite a few mysterious characters. That's the great thing about stories. They can grow new stories in your brains. And who knows, now that you've heard that story, and after you've read a few of Roald Dahl's books, maybe you will go on to become the next great storyteller, creating characters that people are pretending to be in a few hundred years' time. Maybe you can chat about that with your friends and your grown-ups, and if you have any really good ideas, please also send them to us, because we love hearing stories too, and we might be able to use one in one of our next assemblies. Right now though, it only remains for me to say Happy World Book Day, and we hope to hear your story soon. So, Happy World Book Day, and we hope to hear your story soon.